So Deborah, I want to start with your own story. You were telling me when we spoke that when you went to law school at Yale, you did not have a single woman professor?
I did not. And needless to say, there were no courses about women, very few by women, and this was in a context in which men were over 90% of the legislature. There was no woman on the Supreme Court. There were no women partners, no women JCs, general counsel to speak of. And what is striking to me now is how little of that was striking to me then. It was just kind of how law and life were. And I had some interest in gender discrimination even in law school, although it wasn't anywhere to be found in the curriculum, although there was plenty of it elsewhere. I clerked for Justice Marshall on the Supreme Court, and I was interested in issues of diversity even then. But when I came to Stanford and indicated I wanted to teach something in that area, the dean was horrified. He said, don't you realize you will be typed as a woman? And I said, with what I hoped was kind of faint irony, well, you know, it's probably not going to come as a shock to most of my colleagues. I was the second woman on a faculty of some then 36 men. And I said, and you know, what after all are my alternatives? Well, you know, of course, the issue was credibility. And for that, I needed a real subject.
Like tax law or something?
He suggested negotiable instruments.
Okay.
You know, and it took a while for deans to change and the landscape to change. And so I eventually snuck my way into the curriculum with a course. And when I began teaching and writing about gender over a quarter century ago, one of my first articles was titled "The No Problem Problem," because that was sort of what we were up against. People just thought, well, barriers are coming down, women are moving up, full equality is, if not upon us, just right around the corner. And the facts, of course, suggested otherwise. I think we're at a different moment now. I mean, people get that there's a problem. Here we are, you know, in the St. Regis Ballroom talking about it. And, you know, there are commissions and committees and task forces. And, you know, I've got 3 books on women in leadership out there. So people kind of get it. But despite the enormous attention to the subject, we've got a lot of understanding of what the problem is. But we're a pretty fair distance from solving it.
Now, in the legal profession, which is what you work with every day, you work with our, you know, our future lawyers. Women are now about half of all law students, but have apparently stayed, you write, at about 18% of partners
in the major law firms.
And that hasn't changed at all.
Well, it hasn't really budged in the last 15 years. And women are also underrepresented as both federal and state judges. They're underrepresented as general counsel. They're underrepresented as law school deans, pretty much all of the leadership levels. I mean, it's certainly nowhere like it was when I went to school, and my own law school, Stanford, has quite a healthy number of women now tenured. But we haven't really gotten to the to leadership levels at anywhere near the pace you would have predicted. And that's, of course, true. You know, those figures are true for the private sector. They're true for Congress. They're true for pretty much every other leadership segment. You know, women are half the electorate, and we're still at under a fifth of Congress. And you know, worldwide, we rank 95th in terms of representation of women in the legislatures. We're below Saudi Arabia and Bangladesh and Bulgaria. So, you know, there's plenty of work to be done.
And women in business, and I am going to get to talk about solutions and reasons why, but just in terms of diagnosing the problem, women in business now, a third of MBA graduates are women. But it feels to me, at least, that the number of women in that CEO level is actually going backwards.
Well, 4 to 5%, and that number really hasn't changed either. And of course, all of this is worse for women of color, who are just a tiny percentage of women leaders in pretty much all the cohorts. The nonprofit sector does better, but it's still pretty dismal.
So why should society, why does this matter? I mean, Jeff was talking about, of course, his family and his daughters. That brings it into sharp relief on a personal level, but things have been a certain way for a long time. What is the economic reason, the business reason why this should change?
Well, I think the so-called business case for diversity builds on a really common sense understanding. Women account for over half of college graduates, over half of advanced degree students, and if we don't level the playing field, we're leaving a lot of talent by the wayside. And in a competitive global economy, you cannot expect to really perform at the highest levels if you don't take full advantage of the talent pool that you have. We also know, and there are a ton of studies that bear this out, that decision-making is better when it includes a diversity of perspectives and backgrounds. There's, some debate over whether organizations that have more women in top positions perform better economically, and I say there's some debate because the causality is complicated to figure out. Are those organizations better because they have more women at the top, or do better organizations, just like they're better at everything, figure out that they need more women at the top? And figuring out the causality, which way the causality runs is complicated. But I think there's so much evidence about decision making and problems with groupthink that there's a pretty good basis for believing that both organizations that create opportunities are more likely and who truly promote on the basis of talent are more likely to do better in the long run.
Now, from your research, do you think that women lead differently than men? You write about Janet Napolitano, who observed that men, and we have to be careful here because these are generalizations, but that men can come in and implement their top-down plan and try to drag everyone else along, and women tend to try to empower and delegate more. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, most of the research suggests that women do tend to adopt a more collaborative, cooperative style. It's less ego-driven, and that's functional in many political contexts. And I don't think we should assume that that's kind of hardwired, but women are socialized in ways that tend to make them more collaborative. And also, they're more likely to be punished if they're not. Nobody likes an abrasive woman, even at the top. And so women get different signals when they adopt different styles. And so, there are contexts where really directive top-down leadership is necessary, military context in particular. But in general, most people think that women have leadership styles that are, on balance, more effective overall in most organizational settings. And, more men are moving in that direction.
So let's get to talking about what you think would move the needle. How much of this comes down to family issues? We recently did a story about pregnancy tax, in a sense, that once women have a family, they just, if they stay in the workforce, level off, and the men really start soaring. How much of this revolves around family?
Well, I think the work-life issues account for some of the problem. And unfortunately, I think we know that women make different choices than men do if they have caretaking responsibilities. Something like 20% of women with graduate and professional degrees aren't in the workforce compared with just a few percentage of men. 1 in 4 women will take time out for family-related reasons, and that's 1 out of 10 for men. And but I think in sort of fixing on women's choices as the problems, we ignore the ways that those choices are culturally constructed and constrained. And part of the reason why women are more likely to assume those additional caretaking responsibilities is because they're expected to, and because their husbands are more penalized if they try to take advantage of workplace policies. And it's very deeply socialized. One of my favorite studies, it's a little dated now, but among high-achieving couples, 40% of women said that their husbands created more work than they contributed. So, that's changing, but not as quickly as you would like. And some of women's choices are driven by men's choices. If we had a PowerPoint here, I'd show you one of my favorite slides, which says porn for women, and it's a man pushing a vacuum cleaner. So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was famous for saying that what's really critical for women is to find a partner who thinks that their career is as important as his or her own. And too many women don't have that, and so that accounts for part of the problem. But as you know, I think it's only part of the problem. I think there's also still a lot of unconscious bias and in-group favoritism, the old boys network, that it's not just the work-family issues.
Let's delve a little more deeply into that. So we're at a point, it seems, where there's not so much outright gender discrimination, but it is this unconscious bias that kind of creeps into meetings and to advancement decisions. Which seems kind of curious because every company says they want to do better, but this seems to be hard.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the stereotypes about gender really work against women's leadership in a couple of ways. Most of the qualities that we associate with leaders are masculine, driving, dominant, assertive, and so forth, and those do not seem attractive qualities in women. And when women do, there's both a double standard and a double bind. What's assertive in a man seems abrasive in a woman, so that double standard. And women are always subject to being criticized for being too assertive or not assertive enough. Another one of my favorite cartoons shows a picture of a king and a queen in a throne room, and the queen looks at the king and says, yeah, but when a woman has someone's head cut off, she's a bitch. We've all seen it happen. There's a study that a Stanford business school gave to business students and folks in the business sector, and it was 2 profiles of venture capitalists, and one was about Harold Roizen, and they each got the same profile, only one described Harold Roizen and one described Heidi Roizen. It was based on a real Heidi Roizen. And, extremely successful, hard driving, and all the students, both men and women, really thought, Harold was just the cat's meow, or whatever the appropriate Silicon Valley metaphor is, and that Heidi was a bitch. And there it still is. And for women of color, the studies show you give out the same resumes, and someone named Lakeisha has to have 8 years more experience before she's going to get the same number of callbacks as someone named Emily. So that's still a problem. And then there's the in-group favoritism. Just people have a comfort level with folks who are like them in important respects, including gender, and they're more likely to leave people who are different out of the informal networks of mentoring and support services. My last favorite cartoon, this one from Punch, features a bunch of men and one woman sitting around a table, and the chair looks out and says, well, that's a great point, Miss Teague. Now, let's just wait till one of the men makes it. And, we've all been there.
Yeah. So I was on a panel last night about women and media and the Me Too moment, and something that people are talking about is A, will this lead to lasting change? But B, there's a lot of talk rather quietly about men saying, well, I don't want to go out for a drink with a woman now. I'm nervous about that. And should I have a meeting alone with a woman? I mean, you're talking about the ways that men and women interact in companies, and is there a danger that could be, those barriers could get even higher because of the sensitivities around sexual harassment?
Well, I think we're at a moment of real discomfort around some of these issues, and yes, there will be backlash, and yes, people will worry about how will it look, but that's been there for quite a while. I mean, it's just being vocalized more openly now because there's a good reason for it, but men have long worried about being accused of sexual harassment or other inappropriate conduct, just as people of dominant races worry about saying the wrong thing around a person of color. It's just easier in some ways if those folks aren't in the room. That's not going to go away, but the way to deal with that is to increase people's comfort levels, and the notion that men and women can't socialize in the workplace or perform effectively on teams is just belied by a ton of experience in which women have moved in to those high-level positions, and the world hasn't crumbled, and men's careers are still pretty intact. So I understand the reasons for the pushback, but I think we have to push back against that as well.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the role of men for a moment. There's a lot of evidence anecdotally that the younger generation of men are, there's a lot of men in my workplace who are taking paternity leave now. You didn't see that even 2 years ago, that there's at least, an acknowledgement that men need to play a greater role. Do you see this changing among the millennials, the Generation Z who we spoke of last night? These are employees who care deeply about mission.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly it's changed a lot, and the same number of men as women now say that they don't have time for their families and they want more time with their families. What it hasn't translated into is to an equal assumption of the family responsibilities, in part because men still tend to get penalized more than women when they take, not paternity leave, that's a relatively short amount of time, but when they want much more permanent accommodations, so real part-time status for a significant period, that tends still to be viewed as aberrant, and the person's not fully committed. Mm-hmm. And so men get dinged more than women do for exercising those options. Mm-hmm. And that has to change. When Gloria Steinem was at Stanford a number of years ago, somebody asked her, how can women solve the work-life balance? And she said, women can't until men are asking that question too. And I think, that really captures an important insight. As long as these are marginalized as women's issues and women occupy such a small percentage of top leadership roles, it's going to be a heavy lift. So we really need to see these as workplace issues in which both men and women have an equal stake. And my students, the men all want to be involved parents. And they're also pretty realistic about some of the bumps in the road to making that happen.
You mentioned the other countries that are doing better, including, Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh.
Not on every
Not on
dimension.
everything, but on at least politically.
Well, representation in the legislatures, yeah.
Those countries, we were talking backstage, have quotas, right?
Right.
So how do you view quotas? I know that generally it's seen as a non-starter here in the U.S., but you also write that if we continue at this pace, how long is it going to take for women to reach parity?
100 years,
100 years.
In executive suites and in Congress at the current rates of change. So we got to jumpstart that. But I think this country has such an aversion to quotas for some good, and longstanding reasons. The major universities, quotas on Jews, right? Quotas on women when I went to. When I was an undergraduate at Yale, and there was a number. We felt really lucky to be in those early years of coeducation, and certainly in the context of racial diversity, where there's somewhat more tolerance, still people would rather see goals and timetables. A number of European countries have had success, not just with quotas in the legislature, but on boards of directors. And a number of highly successful countries have somewhere between 30 and 40%. Norway was the first. It's not a full fix for the women in leadership sets of issues, and some evidence suggests that just having more women on the board doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have more women at top leadership levels. But it helps, so trying to put pressure on companies to diversify their boards is I think an important strategy, because the most important thing that boards do is they pick CEOs, and CEOs pick top leaders. So there is an indirect trickle down effect. But I think we could accomplish more with more transparency. And that, I think, the SEC is open to. There's transparency certainly around at national levels around certain offices. I mean, most people know that less than 20% of members of Congress are female, but a lot of people aren't aware of what the numbers are in less visible positions. And I think we could do better around that, just by forcing companies to report on that, to keep metrics on what the advancement is. So many organizations have policies without any sort of understanding of whether they're moving the needle on them. So 90% of law firms have part-time policies. Only about 6% of women lawyers take advantage of them because they feel like it's career suicide and they won't get good work and development opportunities. They'll be stigmatized as the part-time pink ghetto group. So we need to know how well we're doing around those metrics.
I'm going to open it up for questions in one quick moment. Just to follow up on that, if I think this transparency point is really interesting. So if it were up to you, would we be seeing big companies every year have to disclose how many women are at the, kind of
Yes.
open up the pipeline so you could see, how many women not only are on the board and at the very, very top, but what's happening throughout the pipeline?
Yeah, and I'd like to see more transparency around pay equity issues. That's another strategy. And we also just need to know more about, training programs. I imagine many people in this room have gone through now compulsory training, and there's, almost no evidence that they make a major difference. And some of that has to do with the uneven quality of training, but we need to know what works. And we do have some data about some things that work. Mentorship and sponsorship programs turn out to be really important. So I think we need to look concretely to see what kinds of strategies are really being effective in opening up opportunities and how companies can do better in terms of making the policies that they have, like work-life ones, more effective. And you know, just to sort of end before we open it up to questions, I think it's important not to lose sight of the enormous progress that's been made just in this generation. As I mentioned, you know, when I started out, there were almost no women in leadership levels, in politically or in the public or private sector. And at my law school, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court justice, when she graduated, couldn't find a job anywhere. You know, no law firm would take her. And I remember giving her a tour of campus at one point when I was leading the Women's Research Institute, and we were talking about that. And her husband, who was a law firm partner and who'd heard the story, I think, you know, maybe one too many times, finally interrupted and said, well, turned out all right in the end, which of course for her it did. And for many women, including I'm sure many in this room, it has. For you and I, you know, it's been okay. But that's not true yet for the vast majority of women who are seeking leadership positions. And that's what we need to change. So thank you all for being here and caring about doing that.
Okay. That's an excellent point. I'd like to open it up to your questions. Please wait for a microphone because we have people listening remotely.
Is it on? Okay. Thank you very much. I'd like to get your perspective on techniques and potentially technology that could help counter unconscious bias in the selection process for advancement.
I think we certainly know that monitoring the decision-making process, having people give reasons for their decision, tracking the numbers and holding people accountable for progress makes a huge difference. Technology also, you know, has been a very mixed blessing in other contexts. Obviously, it's made it much easier for people to work at home, which is good, but it's also made it much harder for them not to, which is not so good. So, you know, we see people tethered to their electronic devices, and that's not a way to have a healthy life or a healthy family life. So figure out some ways to control technology and giving people real time off is, I think, one of the strategies. There are also some interesting ideas about how to monitor gender bias and sex harassment through technology. And one of them is a system that's been set up for sexual assaults on campus. One of the main problems with both sexual assault and harassment is how few people want to report it. And, you know, in sex harassment cases, you know, less than 5% will go through formal channels, and many won't tell anyone. But if they know that there are others who have been harassed by the same person, they're much more willing to come forward, and that's true with sexual abuse. So people have set up an electronic system in which individuals can make anonymous complaints that are time logged, and then they can see if somebody else makes a similar complaint against the same person, and then reevaluate whether they want to come forward. And a number of campuses now have that with sexual assault. My own campus does, and people are talking about setting those systems up for sexual harassment complaints as well. One of the things that the Me Too movement has made so clear is just the power of numbers. And, when women exercise voice, other women come along.
Okay, other questions? Where's our mic? Right there and then up front.
The Massachusetts, I think it's, Nina McLemore, sorry. The Massachusetts law, I think that was passed that requires equal pay. A really interesting article in the New York Times recently about that and the training that's going on in Massachusetts for women. Can you speak to the effectiveness of that so far, or?
The training.
There's
Equal
a
pay.
very, Rebecca probably can answer. There's a very strong training program that's been developed for women to learn how to ask, to learn what to ask for, and to become more aware of potential pay differentials.
Yeah, where do you think we are on pay equity, and how aware are women even of what the, what the reality of the situation is in many companies?
Well, I think that's another area where we really need transparency. The Lilly Ledbetter case, which some of you may know, involved a statute of limitations issue around a pay equity complaint. She was underpaid for like 20 years and, learned about it, sort of fortuitously. And that's what happens. People don't talk about salaries. So making the data more public is useful, and then teaching women negotiating skills. There was a famous book written with the title "Women Don't Ask," and I think certainly that was true. It never occurred to me to negotiate my salary, and it wasn't until Stanford we set up a faculty women's caucus and asked for some transparency. And when they first began publishing the salary data, it didn't have names, but you could sort of plot where you were on the curve. And one of my, then there were 3 women on the faculty, and my younger female colleague walked into the dean's office and said, you have a Title IX problem here, which we did. And, that produced correctives. People began, paying attention to it. So, yes, equipping people with knowledge, both of what the disparities are and how they can negotiate, is a good strategy.
Okay, more questions. Oh, we got a lot. That's great.
I'd be interested in your comments about the impact of patriarchal theologies on how we got here and how attention might be given to that issue.
Oh, how long do we have? It's a little out of my area of expertise, but we certainly know that women's exclusion from church hierarchies has been a problem. And I think now, especially, in fundamentalist organizations, sort of the preaching about traditional gender roles and, some recent accounts of women being counseled to stay in abusive family situations because that's God's will, So, there are challenges to that. But, progressive as this Pope seems to be, I don't think we're going to see major changes in the church hierarchies. And so, there's obviously a lot of progress still to be made, but a lot of progress has been made, and it's on the agenda, and many Protestant denominations have done a phenomenal job in trying to both practice what they preach and preach a more caring and egalitarian message.
Okay, other questions? We have a bunch up here. You have one back there, right back there, and then let's hit a couple people in the front row.
Well, I'm glad we get equality that men can speak as often as women. I'm very disappointed that you feel the need to do this. And I'm frustrated by it, having run companies most of my life. My experience is that women have been increasingly and more loyal than men in terms of moving around from job to job. And my guess is that's hurt compensation along the way, which is somewhat disappointing. you brought up the subject of after-hours kind of bonding in light of the problems of the fourth quarter of last year. Some wives have told their husbands, you will not go out and drink with women after hours. I think we've got to figure out a way to stop that, because after hours kind of bonding and, just talking about company issues and business issues is critically important. And I think for women to be excluded from that platform of discussion is detrimental to their advancement. So we got to figure out a way to deal with that. There are programs in the asset management business, MWB, Women Minority Programs, where large public plans and others have allocated capital to women-owned money management businesses. All the data suggests that women are as good or better money managers than are men, because they tend to be less emotional in terms of their decision-making process. But these programs are still finding a lack of women to whom they can allocate capital. So I'm not sure I'm asking a question. I'm expressing some of the frustrations that you feel. But my conclusion is the same as yours. There's a big talent pool out there, and we're not taking advantage of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And, I long for the day when we don't have these programs either. But, as Gloria Steinem said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. So I think we're still at the kind of pissed off phase.
1, 2.
Thank you. Hello. My question for you is, what advice will you give to Latino women that due to their culture and oppression do not develop these leadership skills?
Good question.
Yeah. Well, as I've tried to indicate, yes, all the problems I've described are, I think, magnified for women of color. And, they're somewhat different for each ethnic and racial group, so you don't want to generalize too much. But I think both Latina and Asian women have been hobbled by the notion that they should not be so assertive and put themselves forward. And I think that's one of the things that leadership development programs, especially those geared to women of color, can help address. So there are ways to navigate that stereotype. One of my favorites, which was coined by a University of Michigan president, was relentlessly pleasant. And when Sheryl Sandberg was writing her book, she interviewed me about some of the research, and I mentioned that. And she called later to track that down, and there it is in her book. That's one thing that works, and it works especially for groups where women have been socialized to not be too assertive or abrasive.
So can you go a little bit further? What does that mean, like relentlessly? Like always having a smile on your face?
Yeah. Oh, and just being really nice as you deliver the cold, hard truth. One of the first presidents of the American Bar Associations, who was from Florida, said she thought that talking in a Southern accent was really helpful, because when she was being extremely insistent, she was always very careful to do it in the nicest possible way and pay attention to the feelings of the person that she was firing. Sugarcoating, however you want to describe it, the steel magnolia is the other common cliche, but I think there's some truth to it, that people can develop those skills.
Okay, question right here up in front. He's been very patient.
Thank you for your candor and your insights. I have another advice type question. What advice would you have for teenage, high school aged girls who are starting to look forward and plan their higher ed trajectories and future careers?
And can we maybe put boys in that too? As a mother of boys?
Yeah, because, we got to raise feminist sons. Dream big, I really do think that we're at a point at which everything's on the table now. And women have broken enough of those barriers so that you can see role models in pretty much all of those leadership positions across the board. So, follow their heart. Tell them to follow their heart. And I think I'd say the same thing to boys, and just be open to a range of different experiences and perspectives. Our college campuses really offer that in a way that we didn't before. And I also think it's really important to tell people to get out in the world and get out of their comfort zones and, see a little bit of how the other half lives, and think about ways that you can make a positive difference in the world. This may be the side of me that teaches legal ethics as well as gender, but I really want to see the young generation cultivate an ethic of service and commitment to the common good and leaving the world a little better than the place they found it. And I would hope that people would look for those opportunities in higher education. And they're really pivotal, I think, in developing people of empathy and civic engagement. So do some service.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Right back there and then up here.
Hi, my name is Carol Wedge. I'm a CEO of an architecture firm. I joke that my epitaph is "that bitch is nice." And one of the questions I have is, when do you see, or do you see Fortune 500 companies moving towards covering the cost of daycare? The way they cover the cost of health insurance for their employees. Daycare now costs more than going to a state university. It's like $1,000 to $1,500 a month for an infant. And that seems to be one of the bigger issues for husbands and wives, or mothers and fathers. And sort of, where's the movement on looking at the rest of the world where daycare is covered? I think there's a statistic that Papua New Guinea and the United States are the only two countries that don't have financed daycare.
Well, paid parental leave, I think, may be the figure where we're linked with Papua New Guinea, and there are a couple of other not so great countries there too. But it's a tiny minority. But as you note, it's childcare that's the major obstacle, and not just the short-term parental leave. And other countries do that much better, and they do it through a mix of government subsidies. Very few put the burden solely on the employer, and I think there'd be huge pushback from that. But I do think that we could do much better, and indeed, in this country's history, have come closer to doing better. Under Nixon's administration, we came close to having preschool education, public preschool education. So we really need to think about how we can deliver quality childcare more effectively. And companies are part of the answer there, and a lot that have on-site daycare have seen, that it's very cost-effective as a recruitment and retention strategy. And so encouraging companies to do that through tax incentives, that'd be a good thing.
Okay, we have time for two more quick questions. Right up here, please. Thank you. We're keeping you running.
Hi, I'm Deepa. I just graduated, and there are a lot of initiatives now dedicated to empowering women in STEM or women in leadership. But throughout college, and even now that I'm a founder, I've had a lot of girls and guys tell me that a lot of the opportunities I've gotten have been because I'm a girl. And I'm curious what both of your thoughts are on this whole concept of reverse discrimination and how we mitigate that attitude as we empower women moving forward.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, who was the first woman attorney general to head the civil division under President Carter, finally got so tired of having reporters ask her how she felt about getting the job because she was a woman. And finally she said, a lot better than not getting the job because I was a woman. And, I think we're still at that place. Yes, if women are beneficiaries of, and people of color are beneficiaries of some affirmative action, it's because, for centuries, they were hobbled and haven't had a chance to have the same kinds of opportunities. And now I think we really should reward, not punish, workplaces that are trying to diversify by giving an extra look at people who are underrepresented and finding out ways to create support structures that encourage their opportunities. So I don't know, do you have a better response on that one?
No, that's a good response. I would say, and just to add to that, nothing replaces working hard and learning your craft. And sometimes I have people come in and want a promotion and they haven't learned how to write a clean news story yet. And so, especially early in your career, it won't take long if you're as dedicated as you seem to be to prove them all wrong, but it requires a lot of work, and there's no getting around that. So I wouldn't worry so much about what other people say as long as you're moving forward on that front and not afraid of the work. Okay. Oh, this is so hard. Let's do. I'm going to cheat here. 3 questions, and then we'll let you wrap up. Okay.
Okay.
Here's the million-dollar question. Are we ready for a woman as president? And what is it going to take to make that happen?
Okay. Number 1. Number 2.
With Justice Kennedy's retirement and changing composition of the court, do you have concern about the rollback of anti-discrimination laws in employment? And what do you foresee the impact will be, and where will it be most felt? Or do you think our society has moved to a different point in terms of consciousness and that it won't have as big an impact as it may have been?
Okay, and then one last question. Was there another one up here in the front? I'm sorry.
Thank you. I just wanted to know whether, we hear a lot about the Old Boys Network, and I want to know whether we're developing an Old Girls Network for promotions, networking, mentoring.
Okay.
Okay, so needing to end on a high note, I'm going to take that question about the courts first. Nothing good is going to come of the next few years of judicial appointments from the standpoint of equity. Well, from the standpoint of many things, but certainly gender equity. And I think the Kennedy's replacement, and God love her, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is in her mid-80s. Another justice is not far behind, so there could be more vacancies before this administration is past the point of making the appointment choice. So it's not a good scene, and we're going to have to rely less on the courts, more on the legislatures. If we get rollbacks on things like Roe against Wade, which I think we almost certainly will, it'll be up to legislatures to put those protections in place. And, there are ways to do better around issues like reproductive justice and other hot-button issues, but it's going to require some organizing and getting people to the polls. And the only, I think, sort of silver lining I can see from this is maybe it will motivate more progressives to get out and vote once they see what's at stake with judicial appointments. In terms of old girls networks, yes, there are, and tons more. And I think the huge increase in women running for office is a signal of that. Emily's List got 16,000 requests for assistance compared with 1,000 the previous year. I mean, there's just been a mushrooming in that. And of course, not all those candidates are going to make it, but I think we're seeing a groundswell of interest and willingness of women to run, because when women do run, they do just as well. The problem historically, or at least in the last decade or so, has been that women don't run. So we got a chance to change it. And yes, I do think there's going to be a woman president, not necessarily in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of many others sitting in this room. Let's not forget, we had a woman candidate who won the popular vote. We're not where we want to be yet, but, we're not where we once were, as Martin Luther King famously put it. So thanks to all of you for caring about this, because that's what's going to make it change.
Thank you so much for a fascinating conversation.